This is some of that Indonesian live rock. There's a variety of pieces in here. You can see this is an old coral head or branching coral that's now become encrusted with a whole bunch of different things on it. Here's some slab rock, some flat pieces. So this will allow for some pretty interesting aquascaping in the tank. I had mentioned I was going to pump that water from those reservoirs into the tank tonight so I could get it up and running. And I was bragging about my favorite little sump pump. But for some odd reason, it doesn't have the fittings in there for me to hook up the garden hose. Wouldn't surprise me if the manufacturer of the pump doesn't include that. But on the other hand, it could be in the box somewhere here, and it's Friday night, no one's around, and I'm determined to get this tank up and running tonight. So without that, I can't use the pump. Doesn't mean we can't do it manually. And when I say manually, I'm referring to siphoning it out of those containers into a 5-gallon bucket and then manually lifting it up and pouring it into the tank.
And if you're going to be an aquarium hobbyist, you have to learn how to start a siphon. And the key to starting a siphon is it always has to be going downhill.
It'll take a little bit longer, but I'm determined to get it up and running tonight.
So with that said, I have to siphon out enough water to fill the 5-gallon bucket and then lift the bucket up to the tank and pour it in.
So it's going to be a little extra work. Probably having to put 30, maybe 40 gallons in, 5-gallon bucket at a time. But when you're determined, there's no way around it. And besides that, what's the motto of our show? Keep moving forward. Looks like that's just about ready to go over the overflow at the end and start filling up down in the filter system.
We'll go ahead and lift one more 5-gallon bucket up there and pour it into the tank. And there you go. The first amount of water to pass from the tank through the overflow is now beginning to fill up the filter. We need to take a couple of moments here and just go through and check all of our connections on the drain side of the aquarium. Doesn't appear that there's any water being dropped onto the floor of the cabinet, and everything's contained within the pipes. So let's lift another bucket up there.
So we've reached that magical moment where we're ready to plug it in and start the system. I've gone through twice now, double checked all the fittings, all the snap clamps, all the union fittings, all the hose connections. Everything appears to be as it's supposed to. There's one thing that I always expect, I don't count on, but I expect at least one leak. Psychologically, at least I'm prepared then to deal with it. Be nice if there were no leaks though. So, this is the pump for the filter portion of the circulation as opposed to the internal portion of the circulation. And what I mean by that is there's one pump that draws from the filter system, sends water back to the tank. That water goes into the overflow and back into the filter. We'll call that filter circulation. That's driven by this Iwaki 40, which does about 700 gallons an hour. The second type of circulation, as I said, was called internal circulation. there's a pump down at the far end that does 3,600 gallons an hour. It sucks directly from the tank and returns its water directly to the tank via those two sea swirl units. So again, there's two types of water flow in this tank. Internal circulation, which is water within inside the tank, and filter circulation. We're now ready to plug in the pump for the filter circulation side. This water is going to be drawn out. It's going to be pumped to the end of the cabinet all the way up to the chiller unit up above, and then come back down and introduce itself into the face of the internal overflow, and that'll spill into the tank, which in turn goes into the overflow, back down to the filter, and around and around and around it goes. Let's see if we can do it with no leaks. Pump needs to prime itself first. Now what happened there is we haven't allowed the pump to prime itself, and because all the tubing and plumbing is hooked together, it can't expel the air that's trapped inside there. What you heard was the impeller turning in a dry state. There's no water in where the impeller itself is. So what I need to do is loosen this clamp right here, which again, those snap clamps just twist sideways and they come right off. I need to take this piece of tubing off, which will allow that pump to breathe and expel at least the air in the impeller portion of it. I could hear the air pressure relieve itself. So what's happened now is I've allowed air to escape out of that pipe, which has allowed the water to fill the pipe and the pump itself. So now it should be primed.
And now that I've allowed that water pump to release the air that was trapped inside of it, and it's primed itself, we're now going to slip the tubing back onto that barb connector. We'll use one of those nifty snap clamps, tighten it or re-secure it, and we're ready to go.
So now we're ready to try it again. There, she's primed.
And now that the water pump is primed, it's discharging the water from the filter through the pump and up into the aquarium.
So here's that water pump and its discharge all the way up here, and then follows that clear tubing. And that clear tubing passes along here, makes a turn up there, passes up alongside the wall, up to the refrigeration unit, goes through what we'll call the chiller barrel, exits the chiller. By the way, I'm very pleased to say that MJ apparently figured this out on his own. Input into a chiller barrel is always at the bottom as opposed to the top. If you hook the input at the top, it can't push the air inside the barrel out of it. So you want to introduce the water through the bottom, forcing the air up and out, and that line comes down behind the tank, makes a curve, and then goes up into the bottom of the overflow right there, which in turn you see it rising up there and discharging out there. And again, that's called filter circulation. So water is moving from the tank into the overflow, down into the filter, through that micron sock, and into the reservoir itself, where it's picked up by that water pump. Some of it will go to the protein skimmer, not yet because we have to put salt in there. And the balance, again, gets discharged up there, which goes all the way up to that refrigeration unit, and then back into the tank. I don't see any leaks or drips, so I think we're doing good so far. So one of the two pumps is now running. Theoretically, we could pour the salt in now and it would begin to dissolve. I think, though, the better thing to do is make sure the entire system is working properly, or in this case, leak-free. Why? Why waste the salt if there's a leak and I have to drain the water or discard the water or do something where I have to be able to get into the tank? I would have just wasted the salt mix. So I'm going to start on that internal circulation pump now. Once I get that running and I'm happy with the way the system's working, I'll then add the salt. So I'm going to go through, make sure all these union fittings are tight. And this pump too will need to prime itself. So we're going to open the bottom valve, or on the inlet side of the pump. I can hear the water passing down into it. I don't see any drips on the wood. Let's go ahead and open the return side. So that pump should have primed itself now. Again, we've allowed water under pressure to come down, fill this up. We open this valve and you heard the air escape. So that pump impeller should now be primed. And so far it appears as though there's no leaks or drips. So I think we can go ahead and plug it in and see if it's gonna run. That's a pretty quiet pump, huh? So again, this pump draws in through the strainer, which is in the face of the internal overflow, pulling water from the tank, comes down that PVC pipe through the valve, elbow into the bottom of the pump. I do see one little drip. Right there. See it? I'll address that. And then it discharges back up. And that discharge comes up there, splits into those two, comes over here to a sea swirl. I don't know if you can see. That's the sea swirl discharging at this end. It's not turned on and oscillating yet, but that's the flow there. And you can see the opposing one down there. And I don't see any drips or leaks on top of the tank or underneath any of the fittings. So, it's that one drip right there. So let's see if we can figure out what it is and how to resolve it.
It's always tricky to try to determine how much of that Teflon tape it requires to seal the fittings. In this particular situation, you can see that tiny little drop is passing through between the threads and the Teflon tape I've used to seal it. I'll have to take this apart and re-Teflon tape those fittings to stop that leak.
So our 280-gallon coral reef tank just came alive. Make sure to come on back for part 3 as we add the salt to the system and double check for more leaks and figure out how we're going to fix that leak out of the circulation pump.